Thank you, Hallie and Rachel and all at the Bulletin for inviting me to join in this conversation today. I know I'm really excited to get into it with Adam and Lynn and hear questions from our audience as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lynn and Adam, and then we'll kick this conversation off. So Lynn Rusten serves as the Vice President for the Global Nuclear Policy Program at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. In this role, she leads NTI's efforts aimed at reducing the risk that nuclear weapons will be used, preventing their spread, and ultimately ending them as a threat to the world. She has held senior positions in the White House National Security Council, the Department of State, and Congress. Adam Mount is a senior fellow and director of the Defense Posture Project at the Federation of American Scientists. His work covers US nuclear strategy and force structure, conventional deterrence, and progressive foreign policy. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So today we're going to be discussing the Biden administration's emerging nuclear policy with a particular focus on discussing the recently completed nuclear posture review, the president's budget requests, the impacts of the war in Ukraine on US nuclear policy, and other various issues. Over the past year, the Biden administration has been undertaking a nuclear posture review. This is a program that many new presidential administrations undertake to review what exactly is the United States nuclear posture. On March 28th, the White House announced that it had transmitted to Congress the classified version of its national defense strategy, which included the nuclear posture review, as well as another review called the Missile Defense Review as annexes. That same day, the Biden administration released its budget request for fiscal year 2023, which asked for $813 billion for national defense, including $50.9 billion in nuclear weapons spending across the Departments of Defense and Energy. While the NPR is still yet to be released in its unclassified version, and the budget picture is still fully coming together, let's dig into what we know so far. Lynn, let's start with you. What do we know about the NPR thus far, nuclear declaratory policy in it, and a general understanding of the Biden administration's nuclear policy 1 year in?
Thanks, Monica, and thanks to the Bulletin for having us today for this important discussion. So recognizing, as Monica just said, that the full unclassified version hasn't been released yet, but we have information based on some off-the-record briefings and things that have been in the press. And of course, the budget, the president's budget is revealing. So I'd say the bottom line for me is that the Biden review will reflect a lot of continuity with the past, but it will also have some very different changes in terms of its overall tone and some specific policies, especially in contrast with the Trump administration NPR. In some ways, I think it's going to be a lot closer to the Obama administration NPR, even though the threat environment is a lot different than it was in 2010. If you want me to go on in a little bit more detail, I think one of the big differences in tone, and of course it's substance too, is that there'll be a return to much more emphasis on strategic stability, seeking to avoid costly arms races if possible, and US leadership in non-proliferation and arms control, as well as a recommitment to the long-term goal of disarmament, which of course is a US policy as a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. On declaratory policy, I think it will reflect a return to the policy of the Obama administration, basically saying that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter the use of nuclear weapons. So this would be a less restrictive policy in terms of the purpose of nuclear weapons than that of sole purpose, which, as we all know, is what the president as a candidate said he hoped to work for. But it's also more restrictive than the Trump administration declaratory policy, which really expanded the role of nuclear weapons in terms of responding to non-nuclear threats. And then finally, it reflects in the continuity, it reflects a large commitment to funding the ongoing modernization programs, to the triad, and specifically to the next generation ICBM, But it does cancel a couple of nuclear programs that the Trump administration had supported. It cancels the nuclear slickum, although that's already a subject of debate in Congress and apparently even within the administration in public. And also it would return to the plan to retire the B-83 air-delivered bomb, which is the largest megaton bomb in the arsenal, and it's one that the Obama administration had slated to retire. So that's my top headline on what we think will be in the NPR.
Thanks, Lynn. Very comprehensive. Adam, anything to add there?
No, that's a great overview. And I think it's right to place emphasis on the fact that this is largely a return to many of the positions in the Obama NPR, which, as we remember, was widely accepted and appreciated by a sort of consensus group of politicians, both on the left and the right. And so insofar as that's the case, maintain a safe, secure, reliable arsenal, fund modernization. In that regard, that was a sort of consensus that was widely held in Washington. Since then, the geostrategic environment and the national conversation on nuclear weapons has evolved pretty significantly. As the Trump administration took steps to increase reliance on nuclear weapons, now that has in some ways dragged the conversation further to the right. So we can expect to see criticisms of the Biden nuclear posture review when it's released that probably wouldn't have flown 10 or 12 years ago. One example of this is we now increasingly see resistance to the talking point, the overall goal of reducing reliance on nuclear weapons. So rather than a sort of gradual glide slope since the end of the Cold War, where we were steadily reducing the number of deployed nuclear warheads, working to reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons, now we're into a more of a partisan contest to switch back and forth, to increase and then to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. So it's slated to be a pretty public contest over the contents of the NPR, and you can expect it to be partisan and noisy in some cases.
Thanks, Adam. So as you both have alluded to here, I think it's fair to say the NPR is largely a status quo document, but that's not a surprise to us. I know, Adam, you've written in the past, and many of others have talked about the process of the nuclear posture review under every administration, leading to a document that is going to largely rubber stamp the nuclear policies that the United States has long held. I wonder if we can dig into this a little bit more now that we've established what is the NPR, what's in it this year. Talk about the process. How do these decisions get made, and how is the way that this process is formatted and the actors that are involved in the discussion possibly put up roadblocks to seeing bigger changes in our policy, which were expected under this president who has campaigned on making bigger policy reviews, has been a lifelong champion on nuclear arms control and working to reduce nuclear risks. Adam, if you want to get us started, that would be great.
Sure. Let me quickly make two points. The first is with respect to this question of sole purpose. Joe Biden, as vice president in his last weeks in office, delivered a speech at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was in many ways sort of wistfully looking back on his time in office and making a personal statement that he and the president believed that they could significantly reduce reliance on nuclear weapons and declare that the sole purpose of the US nuclear arsenal was to deter and, if necessary, retaliate against a nuclear attack against the United States and its allies. When Biden, he then sort of reiterated that commitment during the campaign in a foreign affairs article. It was written into the Democratic national platform. When Biden talks about nuclear weapons in support of that commitment, he has, in some ways, remarkably progressive views. He has sort of demonstrated that he wants to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, not just in sort of an abstract sense, but because he believes that some options are dangerous for a president to have. In some ways, that's unusual for a president or a candidate to say that they're interested in limiting certain nuclear options. So he never defined precisely what he meant by sole purpose. And so when he came into office, that ran into significant headwinds within his administration. In some ways, reducing reliance it's a sort of common talking point amongst Democratic candidates. In some ways, it's an extremely difficult goal. It requires you to think seriously about nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities, the missions that they have to perform, and how we can transfer reliance from nuclear weapons onto certain non-nuclear capabilities. That requires an integration of the policy processes, right? It requires you to get people in the room that are expert not only in nuclear strategy, but also in non-nuclear capabilities, in campaign planning. It requires you to, if you're really reducing reliance on nuclear weapons, it requires you to substantively review force structure or plans and policy. And when you are a new political appointee in the Pentagon or in the White House, that can be very difficult to do, to get down into the nitty-gritty of these operational plans. So in addition to that, there were wide constituencies within the Pentagon, sometimes in the State Department, that disapproved of this idea of sole purpose. And in addition, US allies were understandably uncomfortable with the idea of shifts in US nuclear weapons policy that they didn't fully understand. So the critical moment here was when, and I think this really sort of exposes some deficiencies in the nuclear posture review process that were brought into high relief and played out in public in ways that they really hadn't in the past. So the critical moment was when the president issued guidance to the Pentagon that said, look, here's what I think the NPR should look like. It's important to note that this guidance is negotiated between all of these different actors. The Joint Chiefs of Staff weigh in, different Pentagon offices weigh in, and there's really no senior political official that's designated to represent and interpret the president's guidance in this NPR process. In the National Security Council, there's the defense and the nuclear senior directors. The defense senior director in this case and their deputy is a former Pentagon employee. And so it's sort of difficult for many of these people to interpret this sort of highly politicized and progressive goal. Leonor Tamero, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense, who was heading the nuclear posture review, was let go halfway through that review amid criticisms from Congress that she held views that were too progressive. So in some ways, all of this played out in public, and without sort of having a very firm guidance that said, look, here's what I want to do. Here's what reducing reliance should look like. Here's the options for sole purpose that I want developed. Allies were beset by a bunch of speculation and misinformation, pushed back on the administration, and it was difficult to really sort of hold the line. And it appears that the president adopted a much more modest formulation on declaratory policy that, as Lynn mentioned, mirrored the Obama administration's formulation. Really what it sort of shows is that the NPR has difficulty reducing reliance. There are structural barriers to doing that because it's siloed, because it's difficult to get all these people in the room, and it's difficult to formulate and propose coherent guidance from the president. And so in the past two Democratic administrations, there's really been sort of an 11th hour intervention that has said, from senior officials that have sort of said, okay, the NPR ran its course, what do we really want to do? And in some ways that means that you're getting better guidance from the president. It's not just that it's happening behind closed doors and the president's presented with an ultimatum, but it does show that the NPR as a process is not performing its intended function of fulfilling the president's vision for what nuclear weapons are for. And we really commonly do think of these as the president's weapons. And often these days, that's not the case.
Thanks, Adam. So So Lynn, building off of that, I mean, as Adam describes, this process is a difficult one for even those that are appointed by the president to carry out his mission to be able to achieve changes. And talking a little bit about allies in this role, I want to concentrate on this for a moment, because particularly in the declaratory policy conversation, a lot of the pushback on the outside has been talking about, well, moving towards a sole purpose doctrine would not be taken well by our allies. And I know that this is something that the administration worked on, at least to some extent, throughout the process. What do you think that looked like? How would allies' concerns be mitigated in a possible future scenario to move towards sole purpose, to change this declaratory policy, if the existing process of the NPR is not one that's going to be conducive to change?
So I'll get to your specific question, but let me back up a little bit and start where Adam left off, which is a very important point, which is that nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy is inherently presidential. And when I look at how where the NPR is coming out and what the administration's policies are, I look at it through the lens of priority and opportunity. And my assessment is that although we have a president, maybe the most ever, knowledgeable and committed president in terms of really understanding nuclear policy, nuclear arms control, strategic stability, all those issues, and clearly has a deep personal concern and interest. My assessment is this was not actually among the top administration priorities. And by this, I mean nuclear policy, nuclear arms control. It just didn't make the cut in terms of when you think about the priorities they came in with, obviously the pandemic, the domestic agenda, and even in the foreign affairs realm, there was restoring alliances, there was climate, of course, there was JCPOA. So, I think they really came in with, yeah, the president would like to do something in terms of, a New START successor, strategic stability with Russia, and try to advance the conversation on these issues with China. But it wasn't more ambitious than that, number one. And then that relates to what was the opportunity. And I think, it was understood that the opportunities were not easily grasped, both with our relationship with China and the projected growth of China's nuclear arsenal, which is a complicating factor in how you, obviously an important factor in how you project what our requirements are going into the future, and the difficult relationship with Russia, and the challenges that we would face in trying to come up with the next set of agreements. And frankly, the political angle of, a Senate that is very closely divided, slight narrow majority. So, all of that meant an environment where I think it wasn't a priority to take on a lot of fights in this area. And so I think that's where we are. And so getting to the, sole purpose and allies, it's clear that there was a lot of discomfort expressed by many allies in terms of a change in declaratory policy towards sole purpose. And I think it's pretty clear that even though I think the president personally would be very comfortable with moving to that policy, is my impression, that it wasn't worth the turbulence that it would have created. And especially, of course, and even if they were close to getting there, then everything that has happened with Russia in the last couple of months leading to the war just only reinforces that this wasn't the time that the administration was going to take on that, that difficult step with allies.
Thank you, Lynn. And on that point, I want to turn right back to you and talk about kind of the elephant in the room right now, which is Russia and the war in Ukraine. There's a whole lot that we can discuss about the impacts of the war in Ukraine on nuclear policy. And in general, the nuclear threats that and the nuclear undertones of the war right now, because of the way Putin has been making comments and just overall the international environment surrounding nuclear weapons in this war. But I want to focus on how it has changed to any extent the nuclear posture review, the Biden administration's nuclear policy thus far. There wasn't much time between the wrapping up of the NPR and its release and briefing to Congress from the start of the war. But we also knew that Ukraine could and likely would be an issue for many months. The government knew. So how do you foresee that the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression has changed nuclear policy to this point, and particularly even more so, how is it going to change things going forward? The last strategic nuclear treaty between the United States and Russia expires in 2026. This was something that we were negotiating with them on, a follow-on treaty, having initial conversations about what that could look like, but those talks are on hold because of the war in Ukraine. So big question, but how is Ukraine affecting the Biden administration's nuclear policy?
I'm sorry, who are you directing?
Sorry, Lynn, we'll start with you. Apologies.
Oh, okay. Well, it's clear that a lot of all three of the documents that you're talking about, or at least certainly the defense strategy, was going to be written with a very strong focus on China. And it sounds like some of the delay in the releasing of the unclassified versions of all three reports, meaning that in the posture review and the missile defense review are some readjustments reflecting the situation with Russia. And so maybe some rebalancing in terms of how they describe the threat environment. It's, where I think China's been described as sort of the long-term strategic, pacing threat. Russia, a near-term acute threat is the language I've heard used. And then there's persistent threats like Iran, North Korea, and violent extremism, terrorism, that kind of thing. In terms of, I think administration officials have been clear that they're still committed, if there's an opportunity, to at some point getting back to a strategic stability dialogue with Russia and working on a New START successor. I don't know when that'll happen. I think there's still internal homework to do that they're doing, and that similarly they would like to get the strategic stability dialogue with China going, which Presidents Biden and Xi committed to in their joint statement following their virtual summit late last fall. But one thing that's really unclear to me is, I know that China is factoring large in the posture review, but it hasn't been really clear to me how that will be expressed. And it may be that the review itself won't be very detailed in terms of what does that mean in terms of numbers. What numbers can we live with? How does China affect? How will it affect our position in terms of what kind of limits we would want in a future agreement if we can get one with Russia? I think they've made clear that it's not whatever we would want to do with Russia in terms of limiting nuclear weapons. We'll obviously have to have one eye toward China, but it's not going to be sort of an easy mathematical equation. So that's unclear. But of course, the harder question is, how do we get back to an environment where we can even have a productive dialogue with Russia, and what will our requirements be? And there's, of course, a whole other set of issues. That's the basket of kind of bilateral strategic, and then there's a whole European security issues, both conventional forces, stationing of forces, stationing of nuclear forces on both sides, that will need to be addressed if we're going to try to reestablish any kind of enduring Euro-Atlantic security architecture, which, to state the obvious, is completely broken down. And it's going to be a while before we can figure out how to get back to a safer place. And certainly a lot will matter how the current conflict ends, and what's the settlement with Ukraine, and what are the implications going forward. So there are a lot of unknowns.
Thanks, Lynn. Adam, anything to join in on the Ukraine question and Russia and in general, the strategic environment impacting the future of nuclear policy under this administration?
Sure. Lynn gave a great overview, especially on the difficulty in pursuing an arms control strategy and approach. This is something I think the Biden administration cares deeply about, but it's becoming more and more difficult given bilateral relationships with China and with Russia, to say nothing of North Korea, but also the sort of overall environment that places reliance on nuclear weapons and sees nuclear weapons as a valid and necessary counter to these activities in adversary states. With respect to Ukraine, it's really become Putin's standard operating procedure to try to inject nuclear weapons into what is fundamentally a non-nuclear crisis. And the remarkable thing is the US media has essentially amplified these concerns, has helped Putin do this. You saw blaring headlines about Putin raising his nuclear alert level, as sort of a way of increasing the risk of nuclear use. The risk of nuclear conflict and nuclear use exists. In my view, it's relatively low. Putin would not benefit from employing nuclear weapons, certainly not against NATO, and almost certainly not against Ukraine. The remarkable thing is the administration has had a much more level-headed view towards these sort of very public, very noisy concerns, which is to say, and they've said this repeatedly, we have not seen these kinds of muscle movements from the Russian military. We have not seen them alert their forces. We've not seen changes in the readiness status or the positioning of Russian nuclear forces. We're watching for that very closely. So in some ways, this demonstrates how US and allied nuclear forces really are not the most salient capabilities here. What we want is to have the political resolve and the options and the conventional strength that allows us to continue to pursue our policy and advance our interests and not be intimidated and not sort of follow Putin into nuclear brinksmanship, which would only serve his interests and his objectives. So in terms of how the Ukraine crisis has affected US nuclear strategy, I think it largely hasn't. And that's the right approach. It's just not relevant. It doesn't give us any additional capabilities here. But in the sort of broader context of the US conversation, there's a very simple, Lynn spoke of a sort of simple mathematical equation, and that exists on the political side. Threat goes up, partisan support for nuclear capabilities, for modernization also goes up in accordance. And that's absent any of this sort of difficult rethinking about conventional versus nuclear reliance and what capabilities do we really need to confront these kinds of dangerous situations.
Thanks, Adam. So one more question for me before we turn over to the audience is on that exact last point there. I think one area we all agree where the war in Ukraine will have an impact on the conversation about nuclear policies on Capitol Hill, particularly in conversations about the threat environment we're facing, and particularly surrounding the conversation and the debate of the administration's decision to not move forward on developing a new nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile and possibly to retire the last gravity bomb in the US arsenal, the B-83, as well as broader conversations that the Hill has been having in previous years around nuclear modernization in general, including the plan to replace the existing Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile fleet with new Sentinel ICBM that it is now called, as well as other nuclear modernization programs. So trying to take a small piece of the pie here in this year's budget cycle, what do you see, we'll start with Adam, as being the topics of debates on the Hill as it comes to nuclear spending? What are the main arguments going to be on either side, and particularly what should the focus be? What should Congress be doing to talk about nuclear policy if it's not necessarily what they're going to do?
Sure, I think Lynn will have and you, Monica, will have a much more sort of helpful perspective here. I will note that already you've seen some contention with respect to these decisions that the Biden administration has made. Really sort of framing these decisions in the context of the Trump NPR. The SLCM, the sea-launched cruise missile nuclear variant that the Trump administration proposed, was not something the Trump administration said, this is critical to our national security. We need it for these defined missions, and it's a huge vulnerability if we don't get it. In some ways, their support in the NPR in particular was lukewarm, and then it sort of hardened as the administration went on. With respect to the B-83 megaton class gravity bomb, there's some sort of mutterings and whispers that this is necessary for hardened and deeply buried targets. But really, the United States has other sort of capabilities and munitions that are tasked with that mission. And so the remarkable thing is you've already seen some dispute and debate about this. In particular, the chairman or the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, has already criticized the Biden administration's cancellation of the SLCM. And so that's something you will see Congress persons on both sides of the aisle pick up on. So I expect that to be a major point of debate. But really, this was the low-hanging fruit. These were the things that the Trump administration put in place to say, look, if you're going to have a debate, these are the things that we want you to debate about, and not about the DCA, the dual capable aircraft that deliver non-strategic nuclear capabilities, not about the long-range standoff option, the air-launched cruise missile, and certainly not about the Sentinel ICBM program. And so largely the Biden administration has sort of acquiesced in that strategy to constrain its options, but it also reflects a bipartisan agreement across the board in favor of modernizing the core systems of the nuclear triad. And so you've seen presidents from both parties do that at very high levels.
Thanks, Adam. And Lynn, I welcome your comments here as well about the battle this year on Capitol Hill and what other ways Congress could be exercising oversight of nuclear policy and creating changes in our doctrine.
Sure. I'll be brief. I think on fights, I mean, you watch this so much more closely than probably either of us do, Monica, so we should actually turn the question on you and have you answer it. But I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't a lot of fights. I mean, the obvious fights are over the nuclear SLCM and the B-83, because it's hard for Democrats to be left of the administration. So in other words, I mean, it's defending what's in what is or isn't in the president's budget is kind of the best you can do. And so I think the things of contention, might be mostly there, recognizing it's also a short legislative season and election year, and none of these aren't election issues. So, but it's also, I'll just make two other quick points. It's also, the Ukraine crisis makes this a really important moment for education, because what we've found is that over the last, decade or more, I mean, the sort of nuclear literacy in Congress, among members and staff, and among the public has really declined. And also there's been a lot of complacency about the risks. And I think the Ukraine crisis, as awful as it is, has kind of brought this to the foreground. So it isn't a moment to, try to talk to people and educate them on the risks and where you want to go ultimately, and why, limits on, for instance, verifiable limits on Russia's arsenal are in our interest and worth paying the price, if you will, of accepting those limits on ourselves, and why we don't want to live indefinitely with a dependence on nuclear weapons for security. I mean, the irony is Russia right now is basically using nuclear weapons as an umbrella under which to prosecute a conventional war. And we are properly doing everything we can to avoid getting into a direct conflict with Russia because we worry about escalation. But I don't think it would make a whit's difference whether we had, 80,000 or 8,000 more nuclear weapons or 10 new types of SLCMs. We'd still be in exactly this position today. And so, some of the arguments about why you need more and low yield and this and that, when you get to the mindset of like real leaders who have to make these decisions, they're plenty deterred by a lot fewer weapons than we have now and all the types we have. So, I mean, there is always this disconnect between the theology and the reality. I'll say one other thing. It is a moment because it's a moment of lack of near-term opportunity to do anything constructively, certainly with Russia. And I think with China, it's just a longer-term process. We have to get into a dialogue, but we're a long way from risk reduction measures and even longer from formal arms control. It is a time to see if there are things you can do unilaterally to reduce nuclear risks. And that's, you know, one of the things at NTI that we've been very supportive is this idea of a fail-safe review that the administration will undertake to kind of look at our own systems and make sure that they're adequately hardened against cyber interference, that we're really kind of red teaming and minimizing the risks of inadvertent and miscalculated uses of weapons and things that we can do on our own to kind of to mitigate those risks. So I'll stop there, and Monica, maybe you can answer your own question because you're the real Congress budget watcher.
Thanks, Lynn. Just briefly, I'll say that I largely agree with yours and Adam's sentiment. I do think that there will be a battle on the sea-launched cruise missile this year. How much of a battle it is will be the question. You're right to point out that with the midterms coming up in November, I think that we're already behind schedule. We're always behind schedule in Congress on passing the annual appropriations and NDA process, but within the next month and a half, we'll start moving towards that, where committees will be marking up these bills, at least on the House side. In recent times, the Senate has taken little action to actually move forward passing bills before they even go to conference, at least on the appropriation side. But I imagine, particularly in the House Armed Services Committee, where Republicans are pretty strong on their talking points and willing to take up battles, we'll be talking about the need to develop low yield capabilities to deter Russia. And as you point out, the institutional history about the good national security benefits of arms control is really dwindling on the Hill. We're in obviously a very increased threat environment right now, and the war in Ukraine is a moment to stop and think about our nuclear policy and to think about what it means to engage with Russia, to engage with China. But it shouldn't mean that developing a new sea-launched cruise missile is going to be the fix to our problem. In fact, it would make the situation extremely more escalatory in our view. So the question is, what members are going to be the ones that still remember that lesson or can learn that lesson and talk about it in a way that matters to them when there's so many other priorities going on and so much push for more spending and more weapons right now. But there will certainly be a battle this year, I believe, and particularly looking forward with the current environment we're facing and with a possible world with no strategic cap on our arsenals. I do think that there's a strong need for education, as you talk on the Hill, to promote arms control and to relearn some of those crucial lessons of the Cold War and engaging the Soviet Union and engaging our adversaries. So on that note, I want to invite Hallie back to the virtual stage so we can get to audience questions. Hallie, take it from here.
Thanks, Monica. Hello again. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner, and I'm the program manager here at the Bulletin. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please put it in the Q&A function so our speakers can see them. This can be found at the bottom of your screen. Please do not put your questions in the chat. When you are called on to ask a question, you will receive a prompt on your screen to unmute yourself. Please accept that prompt, then ask one question. As a reminder, a recording of this program will be available on our website in the coming days. Now let's move on to the first question. So we'll take our first question from Walter Slocum. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My question is about nuclear parity. The Obama administration's NPR was very ambiguous, well, clearly a compromise language on whether or not we needed nuclear parity. As one of the speakers has already said, and thank you for a very good discussion, particularly for the inside information about what the NPR will and won't say. I assume that the new one will have to address that issue, which, as somebody said, has become much more complicated with Putin's nuclear threats and with the scope and scale of the Chinese program. Do you have any information or do you have any views on the issue of whether something that can be defended as nuclear parity is likely to be identified in the declassified, which I suspect is highly modified, declassified version?
Thank you, Walter, for that question. Lynn, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I can take that. And, you know, I asked that question. what was explained to me was that it has some, it talks about rough parity, but not sort of identical parity. And I think that was a reference. I actually, in a briefing I was in, asked about, because the briefing was almost entirely silent on the subject of China. So I was kind of trying to ferret out what, you know, surely it's going to have something in it about hedging with an eye toward China. But, and so that's what I was told, that it's going to come out somewhere in terms of a, you know, rough parity, but that doesn't mean we have to have exactly what both countries have. And, you know, so we're moving from an environment where up until now, China has always been considered a lesser included case. So the United States, you know, sized its forces based on Russian forces, you know, and the perceived threat from Russia, and everything else was considered more or less a lesser included case. You know, the question is, at what point, given the projected growth and diversification of China's force, is that no longer a case? And, you know, you've even seen some military people testifying that we're already at that point. So I'm losing my train, but, you know, but somehow I think what they were saying is it's not completely like additive, but there's some influence on you know, our requirements in terms of obviously what China is or will be doing. And I should just add that, of course, you know, we have the United States has the ability to influence, you know, where Russia and China go with their forces in terms of, you know, their threat perceptions. And I think there'll be more of a recognition of that than there seemed to be in the Trump administration. In other words, it's not a foregone conclusion especially how China's forces will develop, and how we're able to maybe, you know, shape that by what we do with them and in the region.
Yeah, well, it's really an exceptional question. And in some ways, it's the sort of central question facing the US arsenal today and US nuclear strategy today. Many of you might have seen Admiral Richard's statement that the United States now faces two nuclear armed peers. And he says that he worries that they coordinate with each other. And so we really sort of face a unified set of opponents. So as China's nuclear forces stand to grow in the next couple of years, maybe grow very quickly, Admiral Richard now says that it could be 3x or 4x in the next couple of decades. Those aim points are expanding and diversifying rapidly. And so it's just not going to be the case that the United States arsenal, capped under the New START treaty limits, is going to be able to keep up with both a Russian arsenal that's similarly sized and the Chinese arsenal that's growing dramatically. And also, by the way, the North Korean arsenal, which itself is growing dramatically, both in terms of different categories of nuclear capable systems and in terms of warheads. So this is the central problem, and it, by the way, speaks to the value and the importance of reducing reliance on nuclear weapons. We're just going to have to come up with new operational concepts and conventional deterrence capabilities that can help to mitigate some of these risks and to meet US objectives in the case that deterrence fails, because parity is just not going to be a sufficient or adequate or feasible objective anymore. And by the way, I'd point the whole meeting today to comments that former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry made to Kingston Reef in an Arms Control Association interview, in which he said, parity is really not the right yardstick. It might have been sort of a helpful rule of thumb during the Cold War, but the real measure, I would argue, of sufficiency is whether we can meet our deterrence objectives with the full range of capabilities we had. So you saw the Biden administration make progress, or at least support this idea of integrated deterrence. I've argued that's easier said than done, but at the very least, it's a transformative idea and it's the right approach.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, our next question, Hallie.
Yes, we'll take our next question from Gary Jones. Gary, would you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, Adam, you mentioned that you don't think Putin poses an actual threat because he really has nothing to gain from the use of nuclear weapons. I'm concerned that he really had nothing to gain from the invasion of Ukraine. So why do you think the threat he poses is lessened in that aspect?
Thanks. Yeah, and this is something Lynn spoke to as well. In my view, nuclear employment wouldn't convince the Ukrainian government to surrender. It wouldn't convince NATO to stop the flow of forces into Ukraine. It would, and capabilities, weapons into Ukraine. It would raise the risk of a direct NATO-Russia confrontation, which, by the way, Russia no longer has the force structure and the readiness to support. It would escalate further the economic campaign against his country, and it would start to fray and stress his relations with China. It's all downside for him. I am also concerned that if he feels like he's backed into a corner and he thinks that's his only option to prevent him from losing in Ukraine, that it starts to become increasingly plausible and increasingly attractive to him. I think it's the goal of the United States, and it should be the objective, and this is what they've said publicly, is to plan and prepare a set of cost imposition measures, but not to sort of follow him down the road of nuclear brinksmanship. I love what Lynn said here, which is that it's sort of such a helpful reminder that if we had twice the nuclear warheads that we have, if we had new low yield limited capabilities, it would still not be, we would still be in the exact same position. We could not certainly deter Russia from employing nuclear weapons. And by the way, US nuclear use would become no more attractive or plausible or helpful. So it's a dangerous situation. It continues to be. In my view, the risk remains low, thankfully. And sorry, let me also, as just sort of a final point, note that Putin has not delivered an explicit nuclear threat. He talked vaguely about putting his forces on a special service regime, and he will sort of commonly mention or test nuclear capabilities in the midst of a crisis, but at no point yet has he said, do X, and if not, Y. And so there was no explicit nuclear threat delivered. If there is, then I think we are in a nuclear crisis and the risks go up, but we're still several steps away from that.
And our next question will be from Daisy Herdon. Daisy, would you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, I'm just curious about public opinion, and especially as I look at the chat, and it seems like comments are all over the place, and this is from people who are tuned in and interested. I remember a nuclear historian saying that the public is woefully not aware of what's going on, and with the current threat, people are paying more attention, I think. But my question is, to what extent does public opinion influence the discussion on nuclear policy, and is the public sufficiently educated or informed about these policies to really make good contributions to the discussion?
Should I take a stab?
That'd be great. Thanks, Lynn. Get us started.
I think, it's a great question. And I think the answer is publics can affect nuclear policies when they are focused on it and care about it. And I think we've been in a situation, as I mentioned, for a long time where it just hasn't, since the end of the Cold War, it just hasn't been on the radar screen, except for a few notable exceptions. Like, remember the false alarm in Hawaii with a false alarm about a nuclear, a North Korean missile attack. And that really got people's attention, but briefly. But we're a long way from, for instance, the nuclear freeze movement in the early 1980s, when we were in the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. People were worried about nuclear war. We were talking about basing a mobile missile on trains or rails running around the West in the United States, and people definitely didn't like that idea, and they were out in the streets, protesting and lobbying their members of Congress. And, all of that had a huge impact, but there's been, nothing like that. And so this almost connects to what some of the things Adam was saying about the close circle in which that something like the nuclear posture review is developed by a bunch of, people who are very expert in nuclear policy and doctrine and kind of part of that world. And that largely goes on in a pretty insulated way, unless their publics get exercised the way they get exercised now about climate change, saying, we want a world, we want our world to still be here, and we want our leaders to do something about climate change. We haven't been that way in the nuclear issue for a long time, but maybe the Ukraine crisis is getting people a little more focused, that they don't want to live under this threat indefinitely. But they need to be given pointers to what they can do. They're not going to affect the doctrine of a country most likely, but if they in general, want to be limiting and reducing arms and moving away from this dangerous situation, they could be expressing that.
Thanks, Lynn. Adam, you want to join in here? And particularly, I'm curious as well if you have thoughts about public opinion, also public dread. I know that the Ukraine crisis has brought nuclear weapons issues to many Americans and across the world brain again, and it's scary. It can be terrifying. And as you've talked about here, the threat it's there, but it doesn't have to be as high as the media plays it out to be all the time, and as many people might think. How does public opinion play into U.S. nuclear policy, and how do Americans deal with like this existential questions and dreads that they have when they think of nuclear weapons?
What a wonderful question. I think Lynn's example is correct here. It's such a far cry from the nuclear freeze movement in the early 80s, when there was 1 million people on the streets of New York protesting for nuclear weapons, against nuclear weapons and against the arms race. We haven't seen anything like that, certainly since the end of the Cold War. Nuclear anxiety in that point was, certain psychologists thought that they had identified a sort of measurable psychological phenomenon that was impeding childhood development. It had unequal and disproportionate effects on women and certain children, and sort of impeded their happiness. It caused depression. In many ways now, we are sort of faced with dread from climate change, from economic inequality, from the specter of global fascism, including here at home. And so it's difficult to know what to be depressed about day to day. In this sort of huge media frenzy about the risk of nuclear use and nuclear conflict in Ukraine, people regularly get in touch with me and say, can you reassure me, help me sort of go through my daily life? There's no good answer here. The risks exist, and the risks will exist as long as we have nuclear weapons. If we abandon nuclear weapons, then we have a whole other set of risks. The unfortunate fact is that the public is disconnected from nuclear weapons. Elaine Scarry has also brought back this argument that was common during the Cold War that said nuclear weapons are essentially an authoritarian and anti-democratic instrument of national defense, just because they are not amenable to shifts in public opinion. Polls regularly show support for arms control, support for nuclear disarmament, and Congress, nobody votes on that, and Congress hasn't been particularly interested. So I wish that I sort of had a hard and fast answer here. It helps me to sort of estimate and to recognize that we're several steps and mistakes away from a significant nuclear conflict, or indeed any nuclear use. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it's a great example of why the initiative that Lynn discussed with respect to reducing accidental risks, it's a great example of why the president's instinct to reduce reliance on nuclear weapon and to cancel and to move away from nuclear capabilities that could be used earlier in a crisis are so valuable. But we live in an age where reliance is increasing on nuclear weapons and the arsenal is growing. And so I expect this anxiety to play more and more of a role in people's everyday lives.
Thanks, Adam. This marks the end of our time. There are so many more questions in the chat, and I know I personally have so many more questions that I would pose to Lynn and Adam. So quickly, if you both could just give us maybe your concluding remarks. I know that there's been a lot of comments about what should be the takeaway from this meeting. What can they do, particularly if they live in the United States, around the budget, around the posture review? So any quick concluding remarks before we close this session? We'll start with Lynn.
Well, I'll say I'm less sanguine than Adam. It does keep me up at night because we're essentially gambling our security on a system of deterrence that relies on humans always exercising good judgment, having good information, and very complex technical systems working reliably as intended. And you add things like new cyber threats, which can come from an adversary, but also third parties. You know, and you just have to ask yourself, at what point can the system break down? And the problem is that the consequences are catastrophic. I mean, there's no such thing as a limited small nuclear war, in my view, and even a small one is, you know, horrific. And I worry that we've gotten so far away from the memories of Hiroshima and, you know, major wars that people just kind of gloss over the difference. It's not just a bigger conventional war, and we see how horrific that is right now in Ukraine. So I think it's really important to think about where I know where I don't want to be in 10 years. I don't want us to be in an arms race with Russia, you know, increasing from new start levels, China racing to get there, more countries trying to get nuclear weapons because they see what happened in the case of Ukraine. So, I mean, if we don't want to end up there, then we need to work hard on getting back on a track of erecting guardrails to limit and reduce nuclear weapons, not because arms control is an end in itself, but because you see the threat. And if you're able to bound it through mutual agreements, rather than military responses, you know, it's incumbent on us to try it. So I've gone on too long, but.
No, that's great. Thank you, Lynn. Adam, concluding thoughts for us?
I couldn't have said it better. So thanks very much to the Bulletin for hosting, Monica for your insights, and always glad to see you, Lynn.
Thanks, Adam. I'll turn it back over to Hallie to close us out.
Thank you to Monica for that, and for Adam and to Lynn for this amazing conversation. Don't forget to save your spot at the Bulletin's next virtual program, Biological and Chemical Weapons Security and the War in Ukraine. More information can be found in the chat and on our website at thebulletin.org/events. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for supporting the Bulletin and participating with us for the last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.